Okay, so just to explain, I'm MD of Acting Plan, and we're a technology firm, but I'm also chair of BIM4Housing. I lead the Golden Thread Initiative Asset and Survey Information Group, which is principally what I'm going to be covering today. And I've also recently helped establish something called Zero Construct, which I think you're going to start to see quite a lot of interest in. Just in terms of where we're coming from, where I'm coming from, a lot of our customers are the big FM companies, and they're people that are managing PFI, hospitals and schools, and they're in a very challenging situation because they've got very significant legal and contractual obligations to their customers, and knowing what assets are where and how the information is kept up to date is absolutely critical to them. So what we've been doing over the last few years is creating, largely from their O&M information, asset information models, which allow them to make sure that they can minimize or eliminate penalties and the like. And, you know, for example, we're just doing Manchester Royal Infirmary, where we've created a spatial model for 250,000 square meters of buildings. And the main systems that they use Maximo as their PPM system, but they also use KaiCloud, Bolster, various other systems. And it's that understanding. What we're very experienced in is understanding. We're normally the recipients of the data that construction firms actually deliver, and we then have to try and interpret it and make sense of it. And one of the ways that we do that is, although the focus is often on what's called the CAFM system, or system that's being used for planned and preventative maintenance, there's also the legal implication of the health and safety file and the O&M, and this is seldom in a form that makes it easy to keep up to date. And there's other data sets as well, like lifecycle planning. Increasingly, we're seeing IoT coming through, help desk information, and in each case, what we need to know is what products and materials have gone in the building and how have they been treated. So to achieve that, we need a digital asset information model that will then hold all of that federated information in a form that we can then use to populate whatever applications are actually being used. And they are various. The key thing here is that there's no one single application that is used by asset management teams. And obviously, the whole point about BIM originally was that it was to make that easier to collate that information. And COBie was really designed as a mechanism to do that. And if it's used properly, it's very effective in being able to do that. The critical thing is being able to take information from supply chains, and Excel is without doubt the most widely used software application in the whole of the industry. And we need to be able to take information and federate it so that we end up with coordinated information. So that in itself, I would argue, is BIM. Obviously, the thing that everybody is aware of with BIM, thinks of, is the 3D model. And that's obviously a very important part of the process also. But the key thing is making sure that we've got federated asset data and the geometric data together. And one of the challenges that we have is that the BIM process, typically in detail, the 3D modeling process probably starts to or comes to an end at the end of technical design, because the teams that are actually doing the installation work are often working from drawings and schedules. And the result of that is that at the end, we get a data gap because we've gone from digital information to analog information largely. And the implication of that is that FM companies often have to commission surveys of buildings that have just been delivered to find out what's gone in them. And that's so common that it's crazy, really. But it's understandable because of the processes that we're operating at the moment. We're just completing a project for Sodexo, which is a 250 million euro university complex in Dublin. And we've taken some really well-structured, good BIM data, and we've done all the cool things with it with BIM360. And then we've done the verification. But that, in essence, has cost Sodexo £500,000 to do that validation, correction, and translation, which is a huge overhead when, if the information was structured properly at the beginning and we were using standardized data sets, it would have automated that process. And we're just doing the same on the new Mega Labs project. We've just started on this one, which is now operating. It's obviously a mission critical project for the country, really. But we're taking all the information that the team as WSP and Balfour Beatty have done on that and bringing it into Maximo. So another example, though, is this is another, I guess, certainly this week it becomes mission critical, which is the COVID testing centres. Sodexo were tasked with creating 181 asset information models in 2 weeks. And that meant them visiting sites, largely car parks where porta cabins are being dropped in. So they're very simple, but still critical. And 181 is a lot. So what they actually did, they brought back in, because they didn't have enough surveyors to be able to do it, they brought back in the events team from projects like Ascot. So they've got no building experience, but they brought them in from furlough, and they were able to put them on site because they're bright people, and they just produced very basic sketches like this of what the car park layout was. And we were then able to use that to create a very simple asset information model. So this is, we just use Google Maps to position it so we've got the right orientation. And then this is an intelligent spatial model into which we could drop 360 photos. The 360 photos were then used by subject matter experts to basically be able to go through this and pick out what those asset types are and produce an asset list. And the result of that, because it's in proper digital information, we can then automatically validate it against the requirements. So that tells them what they now need to go and collect. And we've done a similar exercise with Peabody on one of their schemes, largely from the O&M information. And we've taken that, we've created a spatial model that they can then use to more effectively do the safety case review on that project. And that now, we've been able to use that on a new scheme that they're now building. So this is now being managed through the new design and construction process. And then finally, as an example, this is Origin Housing, where we've worked with PRP architects who have done laser scans of the building. They've then created Revit models from it. We've brought those into ActivePlan, and then we've taken that and generated the schedules of the principal asset types that are needed. And then we can also generate that, present it in a plan that is a lot easier for the asset management team to work with, and indeed the fire brigade prefer it in that way as well. So the reason I'm showing you these as examples is that I think we need to find better ways of collecting information from people who are not BIM specialists, but are still very knowledgeable. The other challenge that we have is that the way in which the information is currently being delivered from a handover perspective, even on new builds now, is that we don't actually know which doors are fire doors. There might be 1,000 doors in a building that are FD60s or FD30s, but there's only 150 of them are actually acting as fire doors. But without that information being clearly articulated, we could end up with the FM teams having to spend 15 minutes a month having to do the inspections when there's no need for them to do so. Similarly, with fire dampers and fire collars, it's very unusual that we're seeing information that tells you specifically where all of the fire stopping is. Often you might have a PDF with some marks on it, symbols on it, telling you where things are, but that's extremely difficult because it's not actually telling you from a spatial perspective where they are. You've got to read it as a human and interpret it. With things like infection control, we're starting to have to think what ventilation is supplying which spaces. And that sort of information isn't normally modelled in the BIM models. And also things like sprinkler heads. The workshops that we've been having with the subject matter experts have told us that really partitioning can often really screw up the sprinkler head spread, as it were. So one of the challenges that we've got is it's almost like Where's Wally when we're trying to find a lot of this sort of information. If we're looking to replace fire doors, for example, what we probably end up doing is having to look at a plan like this and pick out just from the symbols which are FD60s or FD30s. But for us to really understand the context of that, we also need to look at probably the fire compartmentation drawing. And this information is not necessarily well glued together. Also, we might then have to go and reference a schedule. So this particular project that I'm showing you here actually was a BIM, one of the BIM exemplar projects. But actually, most of the real information was in schedules and PDFs. So and also the specification, for example. Here's another example of that, where we've got the MBS specification here from Chorus. And if an FM manager wants to replace the door, and they simply want to go back to the spec and say, well, what was the door? I want an equivalent specification. They've got to look at this and probably go and get the British standards. They've got to read it and understand what fire integrity means and how that is in the context of the fire plan. The likelihood is they'll just go down to B&Q and buy another door because we're making it too difficult for them to be able to make those decisions. And this is something that we need, I think, in the asset management world, we call it line of sight, so that we've got a clearer way of articulating what's needed. If we look at there's a question mark as to, some people question whether PDFs are actually digital. Well, they're not really machine readable. A human needs to read them and interpret them. And how do you know whether you've missed something? So, for example, if we're looking at fire rating, was it included in all the data sheets? In my experience, it isn't always there. So here, for example, we've got a data sheet from one door supplier, and you can see there that that's the way they express the fire rating. If we then look at a different door manufacturer, who may be on the same scheme, by the way, they're expressing it differently again. And there's another one. So they're all providing the information, but a human needs to read it. This is not digital, machine readable information. And by providing it by not providing it in digital format, we can't really use any of the smart technologies that we want to be able to do that validation. Similarly, we've got an issue if we simply pull down a BIM model. So here, for example, this includes the IFC data sets parameters for a door, plus the environmental performance declaration ones. And we're looking at probably 100 or so different bits of information there. Now, a lot of people would say that's over the top. You're asking for too much information here. Why do you need it? It's just overwhelming. And it's particularly true, I'd agree, if you're going to put this as metadata into a BIM model. But this information is needed. It's needed probably by the environmental team. It might be needed by compliance or the operations team. So the principal thing here is not to say this is too much information. It's looking at how we can gather that information more easily and then present it to the different stakeholders in a way that they can consume. And that's the approach that we've been taking. So one of the things that we're finding, and it is concerning, in asset information requirements that are often written, and we're seeing quite a lot, people are really focusing on just what's easy to provide, which is the absolutely generic COBie data. So the standard COBie data that people focus on it's the type information, which is generic to any type of product. So that doesn't matter whether it's a door, a pump, a boiler, an air conditioning unit, or a cladding panel. This information here, who's the manufacturer, the model number, the warranty, etc., is absolutely generic. Similarly, of the component information, basically that's just how many of them. The key thing is the attributes. Now, I'm concerned because we're seeing in AIRs people saying that we don't need the attributes. I saw one last week. So we don't need the attribute information. So what that means for, let's say, a fire door is you won't know what its fire rating is. You won't know whether it's got smoke stop. You won't know what the door closer is. Now, somebody might say, well, yeah, you can get that information from somewhere else. You can probably get it from a data sheet. You can get it from some schedules. But if that's the case, how do we know that it's being provided? And again, it's not machine readable or machine actionable. So the exercise that we've been working on for the last probably 2 years is creating standardized tools and standardized libraries that can be freely available to the industry to work with. So we've been partnering with some major clients, the Housing Association Charitable Trust, to create standardized data templates that then product manufacturers can use to provide their information. And if we can do that, that can be used for new build and also for existing information, existing buildings. So we then end up with something that then can be used by whatever software application the parties are using. And the way in which we're following that through, the principal driver when we embarked on it a few years ago was for asset management. So as we all know, that's what BIM was intended for in the first place. That's why the government invested in it, to be able to provide better asset information. But since Grenfell, we've recognised that if you know what doors have gone in the building and you can hold information about them from an asset management point of view, you can do the same with safety. And now, one of the things that we're pushing for with Zero Construct is you can do the same with the carbon information. So we've got a triple whammy here if we can get that process right, so we can procure the right information, we can quality assure it as it's coming through so that we don't have to do resurveys and reworks. And that's really the purpose of what we're trying to achieve today. So the overall intention here is that with the golden thread, we're trying to standardize the way building standards and regulations are produced. We're trying to standardize a lot of the procedures that are going to make the building more safe. And we're then trying to consolidate those into reusable libraries, which then, because they're standardized, we can use modern technology to validate that information. So the asset information requirements shouldn't be issued as a document that people need to interpret. Those should be digital information requirements, which then can be issued to product manufacturers. So the product manufacturers are able to verify that the products that they are offering to the supply chain have already been pre-qualified in terms of the information. So your digital information that you want at the end is actually being built into the process. If we can then also record where things are being installed, and there's all sorts of things that the industry is doing some cracking work on in that area, we can then generate a digital O&M. It's an automated output from the process. You don't need to have teams phoning up suppliers to get them to supply information. It should be coming through that process. And therefore, we end up with an asset information model that can be managed in the long term. So the challenge that we've got, the biggest challenge that we've got, is the existing buildings. And we've got 12,500 that are in scope, but the scope seems to move. And in fact, I'm led to believe that we're actually looking at coming down to 11 meters at some stage, which is going to probably quadruple that figure. And we've got a range of different tools that are coming in place to do that. We've got the golden thread, we've got the gateways, and we've got the safety case reports. And the definition of what needs to be in the golden thread is really the pressure is on the duty holders, because they're the ones that are actually responsible for knowing what they need to know to keep the building safe. And that's a very open-ended question. And it's about making sure that they don't really know what is required, because the HSE or the regulator won't tell them what is required, because it's a little bit like CDM, as I understand it, that really it's not a matter of being, the HSE aren't being prescriptive, they're actually looking at what risk is and then how you can then work back from that. But what we do need to do is make sure that the information is structured so it can be presented in different sorts of ways to residents, for example. And we also need to make sure it's easily kept up to date and maintained. And therefore, by making it fully digital and coordinated, then we can present it according to the way people want to see it. Now, if you're anything like me, there's so many of these different initiatives underway. It's quite overwhelming, but they are doing different things for different reasons. But we're coordinating them all, so that what the Golden Thread Initiative did was started to draw together a lot of these initiatives, and the ones I've circled in red are the ones that I'm personally actively involved with. So the Housing Association Data Group, that's something that we've been working on for the last 18 months or so, to create a standard data set which then everybody can use freely. We've also developed, as Active Plan, a few years ago, we developed a templator technology, a data dictionary technology, which we gave to the BRE on the understanding it would be made freely available to the whole of the industry. So that now is being used as the heart of what's called Lexicon, which the CPA is using to try and get all the product manufacturers to standardize the way they describe their product information. So these initiatives are there to really standardize the way things work. So the GTI itself, we've got 10 working groups addressing a lot of critical areas. So, for example, Steve Hamill from MBS is leading the specification group. They've done some cracking work. There's some really cool stuff going on with the digital record team. The information management platform is being done by Ashley from McLaren. but the team there are looking at how CDEs, the various different CDEs, can operate. There's work going on in the regulatory environment. And my responsibility here is the asset information management and also surveying. So what we were told at the very early stages was that by the HSE is that the information that they're not going to say what information is needed about a fire door. What they're doing is basically looking at it from a point of view of what is that fire door, or what is that cavity barrier, or what is that smoke detector? Why is it there? What risk is it protecting against? So we were asked to look at this from a risk perspective, which I must admit, it flummoxed me a little bit because I've not thought in that way. So we started looking at how we could draw on the experience of the people in the team to actually come up with what risks do people have, what are the things that we need to protect against, and then how can we relate that back to the assets that are involved. What we also were then, that led us to looking at how we could draw that together into a safety case. So we started looking at what information was needed to write a safety case. So we worked with people like PRP who are actually doing this for quite a few housing associations. And they told us, and the team at L&Q that have been working on this, they identified what documents were needed to actually support that. And we've created a checklist that can be used by a housing association to draw together all of the information, all the documentation they need to demonstrate that safety case. What we're also doing is then we're using this 360, the visual record, to be able to capture this information. I think generally most projects now are using some sort of 360 photogrammetry to manage the quality and manage delivery. Now, this information we can use in the same way to verify that the right product's been installed, and then use it going forward. And the specification team, the interesting point about this is that they're transforming from being a performance specification to really saying that we need a prescriptive specification to be settled at gateway end of gateway 4. Oh, sorry, end of work stage 4. So the beginning of at gateway 2. All these gateways, it's confusing, but so that's why we've got these maps. So the point about this is to basically we've got here, this is work in progress, so this isn't released yet, but basically what we've tried to do here is to relate the gateways against the plan of work. And you'll see here that really what we're saying is that everything needs to be agreed, and products need to have been selected at the end of gateway 4, at the end of stage 4. Now that's a massive transformation, I think, for the industry, particularly from a point of view of procuring M&E, when in most cases, certainly in my experience on D&B projects, the M&E subcontractors aren't even appointed until the beginning of that. But hey, that's something that I think everybody agrees we should be moving towards. But obviously there's some implications on that we need to be tackling. So as part of this process, we needed to go out to a wider group to be able to contribute their knowledge of what risks are involved. So I was able to tap into the BIM4Housing. I don't know how many of you know what we've done at BIM4Housing over the last 18 months, but what we've done is we've moved it from being about 3D modeling to being much more focused on better information management, which the UK BIM Alliance is basically making as a standard now anyway. So in other words, what we're really focusing on is the information side of things rather than the technology. And we've created a number of different working groups. This has been very active. So we've got 6 working groups that are addressing the different topic areas, different stakeholder groups. What they do, they identify a particular topic, and then we establish with representatives from each of these groups a work stream. And the work stream work intensively for probably 3 to 6 months, addressing particular topics. So we've got a group looking at data standardization. We've got a group that David Emery, who's on this call at the moment, was very actively involved in, with which was MMC. The fire safety group has been extremely active and producing the means of that. We've also got a sustainability group which has just produced its output, and we're probably going to roll Zero Construct into that activity as well. And one of the 3 things that have also on the horizon that we realise that we want to do some coordinated work on is change management, digital O&M, and I think we're now seeing that the golden thread itself probably should be a discrete work stream. The point about the work streams is that they've got a defined outcome that comes from the agreed working groups, and they then deliver against that. And then, you know, once it's done, we don't want them to be talking shops. We want them to be actually action-led. So the fire safety group, we formed these roundtable workshops where we brought together subject matter experts in fire doors, fire dampers, sprinkler systems, and Paul McSolly, for example, who's on this call, he's a subject matter expert in a number of these areas, and he was able to get together with other experts, and the result was that the teams that were on the call learned a huge amount from each other about what information was needed. So these are the organisations that were involved and contributed to the project. And the key thing about that is that we've got so many different stakeholders there, all of whom need different information. And therefore, it's not a matter of saying we're asking for too much information. All of these people need data. It's a matter really of how it's collected. Now, I'm going to break there because I've been talking for probably half an hour or so, but I will show you the work that we've been doing. I'd like to. Oh, there's just one other slide that I wanted to just show. Yeah, these are the questions that we asked in the round table. So for a start, we said, right, first of all, what risks does a fire door mitigate, for example, because this is what the HSE asked us to focus on. When we actually got into it, we discovered that there was things that the team came up with to say, actually, there's lots of things that will stop that particular asset working as it should do. So that was tremendous knowledge share that we were getting from that, from people with practical experience saying, you know, it's not just about people putting cat flaps in the front door. It's also whether they had them painted, for example, which I certainly didn't realise was an issue. And actually, Paul and the guy who was the expert in sprinklers, they identified that an issue with if you've got a dry sprinkler system, to test it once a year, you need to fill it with water, but then you've got to get the water out. And one common way that that's done was to use compressed air to make sure that it's blasted out. But the downside of that is you've got oxygen, water, and the pipe work, and you get oxidization. And apparently, within 18 months, you can end up with you know, the sprinkler or leaking.
I think, Joel, just to say, I think the thing with that is it's about, just again, sort of jumping, just to get back to the point that because of the prescriptive nature of the specification of the system, it may be galvanic pipework, coated pipework.
Yes.
The issue there is it's an accelerant on the corrosion, which is what causes the problems. I think you kind of pertained at the beginning there. It's about getting prescriptive right at the right time, so that the descriptive's correct. If you understand what I mean by that, that was the point we got to with it.
No, absolutely. I think that's the point, really, that a lot of the people in the room, though, I think you would agree with this, Paul, that they didn't know of that. So therefore, because they didn't know, they wouldn't know how to avoid it happening. And there was lots of examples of that. So then what information's needed, what tasks are required to ensure the assets installed properly, levels of competency, and how do we manage change. So I think what I'm actually going to do, rather than actually drop off from that, I'm actually going to show you one of the examples. And we've now done this for 9 asset types. So this is the fire door one, where the first point was to actually break down. Now, some people on the group, they said, well, all we need to know is that that door has been procured from a competent supplier. And they didn't really want to know the detail. But then other people in the group said, well, hang on a minute, we do need to know the detail because we need to maintain it. We need to inspect it. So therefore, we need to know all the constituent parts, and we need to know what the door closer was. So in 5 years' time, we can actually replace it with an equivalent door closer. So that's the sort of breakdown that we've now done. So we also went through and they identified what the risks are, and this information now has been fed back to the group that's looking after specifications back into MBS, and they're now looking at these to say, how can we turn these into standard Uniclass definitions so that those can be much more easily referenced. We've then got the things that people do to a door to stop it from performing, whether that's somebody that's actually maybe even the tenant. And then what information is needed. So what information is needed from at a general level in terms of requirements, specification, then the information about the materials. Now that's obviously partially needed from a safety point of view, but it's obviously really useful also from a carbon zero point of view. The construction information, so how was it installed? What's the mechanism for inspection? Now, there's a hell of a lot of information here, but I've spent the last few days going through this with building safety managers, and they say this is exactly the level of detail that they want to occasionally be able to tap into, but they don't want to have to hunt for it by going through O&Ms to find it. The same with procedures. So what we're trying to do here is follow the methodology that we use in hospitals with M&E. So all the M&E contractors employ very skilled and competent engineers, but they still issue them a work instruction when they're maintaining an air conditioning unit to say these are the 10 steps that we expect you to follow. So that's the process here, to be able to have these as clear instruction sets that then we can follow. Similarly, airline pilots, when they're taking off, they're taken off 1,000 times, but they still go through a checklist because it's a belt and braces process, and you've got then some sort of audit trail. So these are this is for example, from SFG 20, the standard for a monthly inspection of a fire door. So if we can standardize to this level, it's going to make it a lot easier for us to ensure that people don't make mistakes. And then in terms of competency, on the call yesterday, we had Andy Frankham, who's actually defining the competency. He's working on the team that's defining the competency of what a building safety manager needs to be able to do. So competency obviously is critical, but it's a matter of having the right competency and the right evidence of that, plus the procedures. And then finally, on to change management. How do we manage that process? So we've done that for all of those different asset types.